Imagine a world where one family name echoed across the dusty plains of Anatolia, the lush valleys of the Danube, and the burning sands of the Hijaz for 6 centuries. While modern dynasties struggle to survive a single election cycle, the House of Osman sat on the throne through the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the Industrial Revolution. They didn't just rule an empire. They were the bridge between East and West, the gatekeepers of the Silk Road, and the shadow of God on earth. But how did a band of nomadic horsemen, fleeing the Mongol storm, transform from a minor border tribe into a superpower that made the kings of Europe tremble in their boots? It's a story of absolute genius, brutal fratricide, and a bureaucratic machine so efficient it makes modern governments look like they are running on steam. Today, we are diving into the staggering rise and the lightning-fast fall of the Ottoman Empire. We'll explore how they turned the unconquerable walls of Constantinople into rubble, how they managed a mosaic of 100 different cultures without a single modern computer, and why the borders they left behind are still the most volatile flashpoints on our planet. This isn't just history, it's the blueprint for the world we live in right now. From the dream of a chieftain named Osman to the final, tragic exit of the last sultan, this is the epic saga of the Ottoman dynasty. To understand the magnitude of this story, we have to travel back to the late 13th century, to a chaotic, fractured landscape where the old world was dying and a new, more aggressive one was being born. The once mighty Byzantine Empire was a hollowed-out shell of its former glory, and the Seljuk Turks were splintering under the pressure of Mongol invasions. Into this vacuum stepped a man named Osman. He wasn't a king, and he certainly wasn't an emperor. He was the leader of a small principality, a beylik, on the edge of the Byzantine frontier. But Osman had something his rivals didn't, a vision of destiny. Legend tells us of Osman's dream, where a great tree grew from his navel, its canopy sheltering the entire world. It's a poetic image, but the reality was built on the backs of the Ghazis, holy warriors who saw themselves as the sword of Islam on the frontier of Christendom. Unlike other Turkish tribes who fought amongst themselves for the scraps of the Seljuk legacy, Osman and his successors, Orhan and Murad, focused their energy outward. They realized that by pressing against the weakening Byzantines, they could gain land, wealth, and prestige. They weren't just raiders, they were builders. They began capturing key cities like Bursa, turning it into their first true capital. Here, they stopped being simple nomads and started becoming administrators. They created a professional standing army long before most European nations had even thought of the concept. They were pragmatic, too. When they moved into the Balkans, they didn't just burn everything down. They offered stability. To a Bulgarian or Serbian peasant who had been taxed into poverty by local feudal lords, the Ottomans often felt like a more predictable, even fairer, alternative. By the time the 14th century was closing, the Ottomans had already hopped across the Dardanelles into Europe, encircling the jewel of the world, Constantinople. For over 1,000 years, Constantinople had been the ultimate fortress. Its Theodosian walls were considered the pinnacle of military engineering, having repelled Goths, Huns, and Arabs. To the Christian world, it was the queen of cities. To the Ottomans, it was the red apple, the ultimate prize that would legitimize their claim to world empire. In 1453, a 21-year-old sultan named Mehmed II decided the time for waiting was over. He was a polyglot, a lover of philosophy, and a military innovator who understood that the future of warfare lay in gunpowder. He commissioned a Hungarian engineer named Orban to build a super gun, a bronze cannon so massive it required dozens of oxen to pull and hours to cool down after a single shot. When that cannon fired, it didn't just crack the walls of Constantinople, it signaled the end of the Middle Ages. The fall of the city sent shockwaves through Europe. The Renaissance was fueled, in part, by Greek scholars fleeing the city with ancient manuscripts, while the Ottomans transformed the Hagia Sophia into a mosque, signaling that the Roman legacy now belonged to them. Mehmed the Conqueror didn't just stop at the city gates. He reorganized the state into a centralized machine centered on the Sultan's absolute will. He understood that to rule such a diverse empire, stretching across different faiths, languages, and ethnicities, he needed a system that bypassed traditional noble rivalries. This led to the refinement of the devshirme system, often called the blood tax. Young Christian boys from the Balkans were recruited, converted to Islam, and trained in the palace school. The best of them became the Janissaries, an elite infantry corps that owed loyalty to no one but the Sultan himself. Others became Grand Viziers, essentially the prime ministers of the empire. This was a meritocracy of the most unusual kind. A peasant boy from a remote village could, through talent and loyalty, become the second most powerful man in the world. It was this pool of talent that allowed the empire to function with terrifying efficiency. By the time we reach the 16th century, the empire found its ultimate avatar in Suleiman the Magnificent. Known to his people as Kanuni, or the lawgiver, Suleiman pushed the borders to their absolute limits. His armies marched to the gates of Vienna, causing the Holy Roman Emperor to lose sleep for decades. His navies, led by legendary admirals like Barbarossa, dominated the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and the Persian Gulf. This was the Golden Age. The wealth flowing into Istanbul was unimaginable, funding the architectural masterpieces of Mimar Sinan, whose domes and minarets still define the skyline of the city today. The Ottoman court was a place of high culture, intricate ceremony, and immense power. But beneath the surface of this magnificent exterior, the seeds of future trouble were already being sown. The empire was so large that communication was becoming a nightmare, and the very military systems that had made them invincible were beginning to grow stagnant and entitled. The Janissaries, once the Sultan's greatest tool, were realizing that they were the ones who truly held the power of the sword. The peak had been reached, and the long, slow descent was about to begin, but the world wouldn't realize it for another 200 years. The Ottomans had successfully built a superpower, but now they had to figure out how to keep it from collapsing under its own weight in a world that was rapidly starting to look toward the Atlantic and the new horizons of the Americas. As the sun began to set on the era of Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Empire found itself at a crossroads that no one at the time truly recognized. On paper, they were still the undisputed titans of the world, but the very foundations of their success were beginning to shift beneath their feet. For centuries, the sultans had been warrior kings, men who lived in the saddle and led their janissaries into the heat of battle. But a subtle, deadly change was taking place within the walls of the Topkapi Palace. The succession process, once a brutal survival of the fittest where brothers fought to the death for the throne, was replaced by the kafes or the golden cage. Instead of gaining experience as provincial governors, potential heirs were locked away in luxurious apartments, isolated from the world until the moment they were suddenly crowned. This meant that the men leading the world's most complex empire often had no idea how the world actually worked. While the sultans retreated into the shadows of the harem, the real power began to shift toward the sultanate of women, the powerful queen mothers and wives who navigated the treacherous waters of palace intrigue to protect their sons and their own influence. Names like Kozum Sultan and Hurrem Sultan became the true architects of policy, ruling from behind the silk curtains while the outside world still saw the stern face of the sultan. But it wasn't just palace politics that was changing. The global economy was undergoing a tectonic shift that would eventually starve the Ottoman treasury. For hundreds of years, the Ottomans had grown rich by taxing the luxury goods flowing from China and India into Europe. They were the ultimate middlemen. But while the Ottomans were perfecting their land-based empire, the seafaring nations of Europe, Portugal, Spain, and later England and the Netherlands were busy finding ways to bypass them. The discovery of the Americas and the sea route around the Cape of Good Hope meant that the Silk Road was no longer the only game in town. Suddenly, the gold and silver from the New World were flooding into Europe, causing massive inflation that hit the Ottoman economy like a sledgehammer. The empire's traditional tax systems couldn't keep up with the skyrocketing prices, leading to widespread corruption and a desperate need for cash. To make matters worse, the military machine was starting to rust. The Janissaries, once the most disciplined force on the planet, were no longer the celibate, elite warriors of the past. They were allowed to marry, they became involved in trade, and they began to see themselves as a political lobby rather than a fighting force. They became kingmakers, and if a sultan tried to reform them or cut their pay, they would simply overturn their giant soup kettles in the palace courtyard, a traditional sign of revolt, and demand the head of the Grand Vizier, or even the sultan himself. The true turning point, the moment the world realized the giant was stumbling, came in 1683 at the gates of Vienna. For the second time, the Ottomans attempted to take the Habsburg capital, launching a massive siege that lasted for months. But this time, the European powers, usually divided by their own petty wars, united in a holy league. Just as the city was about to fall, the Polish King Jan III Sobieski led the largest cavalry charge in history, the Winged Hussars, sweeping down from the hills to shatter the Ottoman lines. It wasn't just a military defeat, it was a psychological collapse. The subsequent Treaty of Karlowitz marked the first time the Ottomans were forced to cede large territories to European powers. The era of expansion was over, the era of survival had begun. Throughout the 18th century, the empire became a punching bag for a rising Russia under Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, who viewed the Ottoman-controlled Black Sea as their own backyard. The sick man of Europe was a title the empire didn't choose, but one it found increasingly hard to shake off as the Industrial Revolution left the Ottoman workshops in the dust of Western factories. By the 19th century, the empire was in a desperate race against time. This was the era of the Tanzimat reforms, an ambitious attempt to completely reorganize the Ottoman state. The sultans realized that if they didn't modernize, they would be carved up by the great powers. They abolished the Janissary Corps in a bloody event known as the Auspicious Incident, replacing them with a Western-style army. They introduced new legal codes, secular schools, and even a postal service. For a moment, it looked like the empire might actually pull off a miraculous comeback. But modernization is expensive, and the Ottomans were forced to take massive loans from British and French banks. By 1875, the empire was effectively bankrupt, its finances handed over to a committee of foreign creditors. This was a new kind of conquest, not by the sword, but by the ledger. At the same time, the fire of nationalism was spreading across the Balkans. Greeks, Serbs, Romanians, and Bulgarians, fueled by the ideals of the French Revolution and backed by Russian bayonets, began to fight for their independence. The Ottoman mosaic of different cultures and faiths was shattering. The empire was no longer seen as a protector, but as an occupier. The pressure reached a breaking point in 1908 with the rise of the Young Turks. These were modern-minded military officers and intellectuals who were fed up with the absolute rule of Sultan Abdulhamid II, a man who lived in constant fear of assassination and had created a massive network of spies to maintain control. The Young Turks forced the Sultan to restore the constitution, promising a new era of liberty, equality, and fraternity for all Ottoman citizens regardless of their religion. It was a beautiful dream, but the reality was far messier. The new government was immediately beset by internal divisions and external threats. Italy seized Libya, and the Balkan League stripped away almost all of the empire's remaining European lands in a series of brutal wars. The leadership of the Young Turks, led by the three pashas, became increasingly nationalistic and authoritarian. They began to believe that the only way to save the state was through a Turkification process, which only served to further alienate the Arab provinces and the Christian minorities. This was the volatile, fragile state of the empire when the world plunged into the madness of 1914. The decision to join World War I on the side of Germany was the ultimate all-in bet. The Young Turks hoped that a German victory would allow them to reclaim lost territories and break free from Western debt. Instead, they were signing the empire's death warrant. The stage was set for a final, catastrophic collapse that would not only end the House of Osman, but would redraw the map of the world in ways we are still dealing with today. The empire was about to face a 4-year agony of total war, internal betrayal, and a legacy of trauma that would echo for a century. World War I was not just another conflict for the Ottoman Empire, it was a meat grinder that stripped away the last vestiges of imperial dignity. On the snowy peaks of Sarıkamış, tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers froze to death in a disastrous campaign against Russia, while in the scorching deserts of Mesopotamia and Palestine, they fought a losing battle against the British Empire. Yet, amidst the carnage, there were flashes of the old Ottoman steel. At Gallipoli, against all odds, they repelled a massive Allied invasion, a victory that gave a young colonel named Mustafa Kemal his first taste of national fame. But individual victories couldn't stop the systemic rot. The empire was fighting a multi-front war with a crumbling railway system and a starving population. Internally, the paranoia of the Young Turk leadership led to horrific consequences. Suspicion of the Armenian minority, viewed as a fifth column for Russia, resulted in a campaign of forced deportations and massacres that history remembers as the Armenian genocide. It was a dark, irreparable stain on the final years of the dynasty, a sign that the inclusive Ottoman identity had been completely devoured by a desperate, exclusionary nationalism. By 1916, the empire's grip on its Arab heartlands began to slip. The Arab Revolt, fueled by British promises of independence and the legendary exploits of T.E. Lawrence, saw the Hashemite forces seize Mecca and Medina. For the Sultan, who also held the title of Caliph, the spiritual leader of the world's Muslims, losing the holy cities was a spiritual and political death blow. It shattered the illusion that the Ottoman Sultan could still command the loyalty of the Islamic world. When the armistice was finally signed in 1918, the empire was a ghost. Allied warships anchored in the Golden Horn, and foreign troops marched through the streets of Istanbul. The once feared House of Osman was reduced to a puppet government, signing away nearly all its territory in the humiliating Treaty of Sèvres. It looked like the Turkish people themselves would be confined to a tiny, landlocked patch of Anatolia, while the British, French, Italians, and Greeks carved up the rest like a Thanksgiving turkey. But as the Sultan's government in Istanbul capitulated, a new center of power emerged in the rugged interior of Anatolia. Mustafa Kemal, now known as Ataturk, defied the Sultan's orders and organized a national resistance. He understood a truth the palace refused to see. The Ottoman Empire was dead, but the Turkish nation was just beginning to wake up. What followed was a brutal 3-year war of independence against the occupying Greek forces and the Western powers. While the last Sultan, Mehmed VI, looked on from his palace, Ataturk's provisional government in Ankara won victory after victory. The momentum was so total that the Western powers were forced back to the negotiating table. In 1922, the newly formed Turkish Grand National Assembly took the final, world-altering step. They abolished the Sultanate. On a grey November morning, the last Sultan of the House of Osman, a dynasty that had outlasted the Byzantines, the Medicis, and the Romanovs, snuck out of a side door of his palace and boarded a British warship, destined for exile in Malta. He didn't leave with a bang, but with a quiet, desperate exit into the fog. The formal end came in 1923 with the Treaty of Lausanne, which recognized the modern Republic of Turkey. Shortly after, the Caliphate, an institution that had existed in some form since the death of the Prophet Muhammad, was also abolished. In a single decade, a 600-year-old world order had been dismantled. But here's where the story gets modern. The Ottoman power vacuum didn't just disappear. It became the black hole of 20th century geopolitics. The British and French, with their secret Sykes-Picot agreement, had drawn lines in the sand to create Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. They ignored ethnic boundaries, religious sensibilities, and tribal loyalties. They created nations that were effectively pressure cookers, held together only by colonial force or, later, by local dictators. When you look at the map of the modern Middle East, you aren't looking at a natural progression of history. You are looking at the scars left by the Ottoman collapse. The vacuum extended to the Balkans and the Caucasus as well. The ethnic tensions that the Ottoman millet system had managed for centuries exploded into the horrific Yugoslav wars of the 1990s. Even today, the competition between Russia, Turkey, and the West for influence in the Mediterranean and the Black Sea is essentially a fight over the Ottomans' old backyard. We are still living in the great unraveling. The collapse of the dynasty didn't just end a line of kings. It ended a system of coexistence that, for all its flaws, had kept a massive, diverse region relatively stable for half a millennium. The world is still fighting over the pieces of the puzzle the Ottomans left behind. From the dream of Osman to the secular revolution of Ataturk, the story of the Ottoman Empire is a reminder that while empires are built on the battlefield, they are maintained by the fragile balance of culture, trade, and identity. When that balance breaks, the fallout can last for centuries. The House of Osman is a memory, but its ghost is still the most powerful player on the global stage. As we move forward into an uncertain future, we would do well to remember the rise and fall of the dynasty that once stood at the center of the world, reminding us that no matter how magnificent the peak, the descent can be swifter than anyone ever imagines.